The following events are documented for the purpose of preserving a local urban legend, as well as to caution potential visitors who stumble upon this quiet town that I live in. The town I live in is located somewhere in Europe. I would prefer to keep things as anonymous as possible, so that is the most I would go. As for the town itself, it's quite a rural area, although we do have quite a few buildings around, such as a few malls, a hospital, two schools, a supermarket, and a few other corporate ones, albeit none of them exceeded 7 stories. Due to the small size of the town, most people knew one another and trust was relatively strong amongst us. Most people who have the same background tend to flock together, so it was easy to identify who people were based on who they hung out with. Most of the adults tended to stay in the bar or went shopping, while the kids play and laugh at the local park. We also have our fair share of people who simply can't get along with others. The outcasts, I suppose. A few riffraffs who engage in theft and vandalism, sometimes an escalation into a gang fight, but it never got to the point where it was too rowdy. One of the mentioned outcast groups was a crowd of blind people who took shelter in a building they bought for themselves. They were outcasts in the sense that nobody really knew what they did for a living and how they even managed to accumulate enough funds for their daily needs, never mind having a building for themselves. Additionally, they also seem to be living in their own little world with minimal connections outside of their building walls. All we know is that they had a bunch of nurses tending to their daily needs, such as preparing food, aiding them to go to the bathroom, and managing which medicine to take for a few of the elderly members. My mom used to work for them, but eventually had to quit due to sickness. She'd always mention to me that despite how mysterious they seemed to be, perhaps referring to both their affluence and as people, they were pretty friendly. My mom would tell me stories of how well they would treat their nurses, as well as the stories that were passed on amongst themselves. Some of them used to be hunters, and some were fishermen, and others were teachers. They all had their own roles in society before eyesight was deprived from them. Most of the tales my mom told me about were the heartwarming endeavors of a bygone time. Memories that were long gone, but certainly not forgotten, and my mom never ran out of stories from them. As much as they loved the storytelling, they certainly loved one another. Looking at it, I suppose it was a little piece of heaven contained in a small building, but every coin has 2 sides to it. As night spreads across the sky and the blind are tired to sleep, my mom said that they would all first pause in silence and start chanting. They did this around 10 p.m. every day for 2 hours until midnight. Then they would fall asleep all at the same time. During the chanting phase, no one spoke to one another, and it was likewise impossible to speak to them. Mom said that the nurses felt particularly uneasy when they did this, so most people didn't last long. It had the feeling of loneliness similar to the passing of someone dear. Some nurses have had the guts to just straight up ask them about the chanting, but the blind elderly always seemed to have clues to that. On a summer break when I was 16, my mom requested for assistance in the building as they were short in manpower. We had to stay there for 3 days and 2 nights as there were a couple of people who were sick and needed as much medical attention as possible. I was bored staying at home most of the time since my friends were having their own vacations abroad, and I thought I could use the extra cash. Besides, it would undoubtedly be interesting to meet the very people my mom had always talked about. When we got there, it was as if my mom's spoken words came to life. It was no exaggeration that they really loved stories and that they told me a lot of new ones. Stories that were nothing out of the ordinary, but they explained it with such enthusiasm, I sometimes forgot that I was supposed to be an assistant nurse and not an audience. I was assigned to Miss Eleanor Wolf, a lady in her early 30s who lied down in bed weekly. I got to talk with her a little, as well as know a little bit about her as I tended to her needs. She also told me quite a few stories of her own, although her fever impaired her enthusiasm despite her cheerful attempt to deliver a lively story. I told her to rest easy, and if she needed something, she could just call me. As the sun's rays slowly succumbed to its nightly exit, I recalled the uneasiness that my mom told me about. No one spoke about it. Nope, not a single word, but as soon as the chanting began, A hush fell across the building. Undeciphered murmurs filled the silence left by us nurses as we tidied up the room. My vision started to blur as tears clouded my eyes and my throat was clogged as I suppressed a sob. It was a vain attempt trying to hold it in, and I wasn't sure exactly why I was crying in the first place, but I did anyway. Thump, thump, thump. My heartbeat gradually increased in speed as I rushed to stack the monoblock chairs and arrange them in the corner. There was only we nurses and the chanting blind people, but it was as if there was an external presence that was trying to fend us off. I looked at my mom to signal my confusion and dread, but she was so engrossed in finishing her work. I was, however, certain she and I both had the same experience. Come midnight, the chanting came to a halt and some snoring took over. We nurses were also quite tired, so we got ready to go to bed. We had a little dorm-type room where multiple double-deck beds spread across the room. I took my spot near one of the corners and lied down, recalling the dread and loneliness from the past 2 hours. I wanted to talk to my mom about it, but it almost felt taboo to even speak about it, so I maintained my silence on the subject. Despite having a tiring day, I found myself tossing and turning for the next hour and a half. I no longer felt the uneasiness, but the memory lingered in my mind longer than I expected. There was something about those blind people that I wanted to know, but I didn't even know what I wanted to know. I tried piecing together the fragments of experiences I had come up with an explanation, but nothing concrete came to mind. Eventually, I settled down and I fell asleep. I woke up to a dark room with the view of a bed inches above my face. Somehow, the bed above mine was a lot closer, so I turned my head around to scan my surroundings. To my surprise, I saw my own body below me, sleeping in such tranquility that it seemed lifeless. I tried to reach for it, but no matter what I did, nothing seemed to happen to it. As I floated in my new ineffable state, I tried to maneuver myself by kicking at surfaces such as walls of my bed. It seemed to propel me just as it would when I was in water, but I didn't feel like I had as much resistance. As I kicked myself off my bed to the center of the room, I soon discovered that no one else was in the room. I had been all alone by myself. I felt the need to rush outside to find other people, and I wasn't exactly sure why, but it felt uncomfortable being alone in this state. When I got out, it was just as dreadful. No one was around, and I wandered the empty, dark hallways looking for company. No one, but the silence and loneliness greeted me. Room after room, I opened each door to emptiness. After a while, a piercing scream echoed throughout the hallway. I cringed in fear as I recognized the voice. It was my mother. It seemed to have come from the bedroom of the blind, and I didn't want to take chances that this was merely a dream, so I went for it, half relieved to know that there was someone else and half afraid of what I would eventually witness. I hastily bounced across the hallway, kicking wall to wall to move forward into the bedroom. When I got to the room, I was surprised to see my mother's being dragged from her feet towards a door that wasn't there before. Beyond the door was darkness that not even the brightest light could pierce. Several hands grasped at my mother's battered body. Her extremities were filled with wounds as the violent hands from the door tugged and clawed at her. The blind people surrounded my mom as she struggled to free herself. Unlike a while ago, they seemed to be vastly different. They ardently chanted historic words that sounded like nonsense, and they watched her intently. Light brimmed from where their eyes were supposed to be, but it did not flow out of their sockets. As their chanting increased in intensity, so did the groping and pulling of the hands. I noticed Eleanor sitting on her bed, chanting intently as well. I ran towards my mother to assist her, but a few arms reached for me as I approached her. I was fortunate to have reacted in inhuman speed, dodging before they came into contact. As I was trying to contrive a plan, Eleanor grabbed my mother from the hands and threw herself into the darkness. As Eleanor's terrified screams emerged from the door, it had also shut itself and disappeared in complete silence. I felt a large hand tap at my shoulder, so I turned around. It was the head of the group, or what seemed to be the head figure. I would never forget what he told me that day. "Young man, this is a dangerous place that you shouldn't have entered. On this side of reality, there are a lot more perils than you will have to face. I know you're confused and all right now, but I'll explain. None of us became blind naturally. We all fell asleep and entered into this mysterious realm. It was around your age too. That door you just saw? Yeah, we all saw our loved ones getting dragged into it. However," he sighed, perhaps reminiscing of his experience. "However, you were quite lucky to have someone else throw themselves for you. You see, some people are chosen to become guardians like us when they get to your age. It's a brutal process, and you're either going to have to surrender your loved ones or lose your eyesight on the other side. As a guardian, you'll have to protect this town from things that rear their ugly heads during dusk. Of course, our other selves aren't aware of who they are on this side, and it's our job to protect them from the freaks on this side as well as the other people, just as they protect us on the side where we're blind. We protect them on the side where they're blind. It's a simple, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours." My vision eventually blurred as I woke up panicking. I looked around to see everything back to normal. I was glad to see it turned out quite well, but then I remembered Miss Eleanor Wolf. I rushed towards the bedroom, and it seemed as though she passed away in her sleep last night. It was a very different day compared to yesterday. Rather than the mirthful laughters and shades of stories and banter, we were all in mourning for our loss. The next night was quite more peaceful. I dreamt of Eleanor Wolf in a silent pasture, lying down and enjoying the calm breeze and the soft whisper of rattling leaves. When we woke up, it was a bit relieving but also saddening to leave. It was as if I'd spent a whole year with them, but goodbyes and melancholy tend to go hand in hand. Even throughout the car ride towards home, I couldn't help but go through the events that transpired in my short stay and the Guardians. I still visit them from time to time, occasionally recounting my fortunate experience with them. As the years have gone by, many have gone, although some have stayed. Nevertheless, I look up to each and every one of them for their unsung sacrifice and service. With that, I part with a simple message. We often see those with disabilities as people who are in need. Indeed, we must help them with their daily struggles to push through life's hurdles, because sometimes they too can help us in our own times of need. Most especially in my town, where those who see are the ones who are groping in the darkness.